Welcome everyone! Boris Spassky was once asked what his Evergreen game is, and he felt that today's game was the one. Another fun fact, this game was actually featured in a James Bond movie, and the villain of the movie needed to look really smart, and so they had him play the white pieces and win in spectacular fashion. So there's another great endorsement for you. Anyway, this is the game between Boris Spassky and David Bronstein, played in St. Petersburg in 1960. Spassky had white and opened with e4. And after e5, Spassky played one of his favorite openings, the King's Gambit with f4. That's a very adventurous opening, but at the highest levels somewhat frowned upon. It's considered not really sound, but Spassky actually had great results with this. He played it a couple dozen times in high-level games and lost only 3 times. Well, Bronstein accepted the gambit, but after knight to f3, instead of the classical move g5 defending that extra pawn, Bronstein instead played d5, which is considered a safer line for black, just trading off white's center pawn. And after ed5, he went bishop to d6, which is an old line invented by Adolf Anderssen. So black wants rapid development, going knight to e7 and castles next, and it also has the benefit of keeping an eye on black's f4 pawn. White could now go d4 however, in order to go c4 and c5 next, but black has c6 in response, undermining the d5 pawn, and after knight to c3, knight e7, and a trade on c6, black seems fine. Spassky didn't do that, he simply developed. Course cannot be wrong, and after knight to e7, now he went d4, grabbing some space and planning to put his bishop behind the pawn. Bronstein castled, bishop d3, of course a great square eyeing up the black king side. Maybe it's tempting therefore to play this move, just immediately neutralizing that strong bishop. But Bronstein had something else in mind. He went knight to d7, probably just intending to bolster the king side with knight to f6, but oddly enough after Spassky castled, he didn't play knight to f6, but h6, and that at the very least loses valuable time. I'm not sure what he was afraid of after knight to f6. I guess the normal move for white here would be knight to e5, but if white would go knight to g5, which I guess Bronstein wanted to prevent, then black can still go h6 now. White doesn't threaten anything, so the knight just goes to e4, and after a trade and knight takes d5, black doesn't seem to be in any danger. Going back, h6 was played, but now Spassky got really nice play. Knight to e4, so he brings the c-knight closer to the enemy king, or it could simply hack off that bishop on d6, offering a pawn, which Bronstein accepted, seems well worth it. Spassky started his initiative with c4, attacking the knight. Now, if the knight would simply fall back, then after knight takes bishop and bishop takes pawn, white would just stand clearly better. Therefore, Bronstein dropped the knight on e3, forking queen and rook. At least Spassky now has to give up his dark square bishop, but now after pawn takes e3, white still maintained the initiative with c5. That allows the bishop to use the very nice c4 square, eyeing up the black king. And after bishop to e7, black's pieces also kind of get in each other's way, or at the very least black is more cramped. It continued bishop to c2. We understand that move. If white can play queen to d3, then the h7 square will be a constant worry for black. Rook to e8 was then played, also sensible. Now the knight can go to f8 and guard h7. I suppose knight to f6 was also possible. White could then go queen to d3, threatening with knight takes knight and mate on h7, so g6. White could then win that e-pawn, but after knight takes knight, bishop takes and king to g7, guarding the h-pawn, it doesn't look bad for black at all. Going back, I guess Bronstein also just wanted to use his rook on e8. Now, queen to d3 as expected. And here, Bronstein decided to flick in this move, and he later said he was convinced that Spassky would play rook to f2, But that didn't happen. Spassky didn't even take the pawn. He went for something much more spectacular. Knight to d6. Now the computer may not like it, but Spassky is not playing a computer. And when you're not a computer, this move might make you nervous. The queen threatens to come in on h7 with a quick checkmate. Maybe the knight will take on f7. It's just scary. Bronstein indeed did not find the best move. He played knight to f8. Now briefly going back here, why isn't pawn takes knight possible? That's because it's a mate in 2. That much is clear. But black could have played bishop takes knight, and after the check, king to f8, there's no checkmate because the king has e7. So let's say pawn takes bishop, but black survives after pawn takes rook, rook takes, and pawn takes d6, because white can check with the queen and then check with the rook, but black can escape with the king and interpose with his pieces if necessary. And objectively speaking, white actually has no attack at all. Sadly for Bronstein, however, he either did not like that continuation or he just didn't see the danger he was getting in, because after knight to f8, now Spassky's knight d6 move is completely justified. In fact, white now only has one move that wins, and that is knight takes f7. A very appealing sacrifice, but you still gotta dare to play it. Don't forget, the rook on f1 was also still hanging with check. In fact, Bronstein decided to take that right now. So Spassky is down a rook and his knight on f7 isn't safe. Black cannot take that now because of a deadly attack. Actually, let me just briefly show that. After king takes f7, then there's bishop b3 check. The bishop blocks. But then knight g5 double check, so the king has to move. And after king to g8, it ends quickly. First bishop takes bishop with check, king to h8, and then white just removes the defender with rook takes knight, and finally queen h7 is mate. Now Bronstein didn't take the knight, of course. He decided to give some material back with bishop to f5. That's often a good idea when you're under attack. If you're up material, just give something back if that means your defense gets easier. After queen takes and queen d7, it didn't really get easier though, because black's position was already beyond the point of repair. Black's light squares are simply too weak, and even though white is a rook down, all of white's pieces participate in the attack. That's the problem. Now, queen to f4, no queen trades. Bishop f6, cutting off the defense of the knight. Now white has a number of good moves. Spassky went for knight from 3 to e5. Now if I had black here, I would just hack off that knight, simply to eliminate one of white's attackers. And actually probably I'd even give up the rook for the knight as well. Remember, black was still up the exchange anyway. And after pawn takes and rook to e8, of course, black's position still looks awful with the weak light squares and black's also a pawn down. But surely it's not as easy for white to win from this position. In the game, Bronstein just shuffled his queen to e7, escaping the knight. But now another very uncomfortable move, bishop to b3, lining up the bishop with the king. Now all kinds of trouble is possible after the knight jumps out of the way. There's no hope for black now. Bronstein at this point did take that knight on e5, but then white recaptured with check, and after king to h7, the light squares proved to be black's biggest issue, because after queen e4 check, Bronstein had seen enough and actually resigned. Now let's see what could have happened if king to h8. Then it's a forced checkmate. Rook takes knight removes the defender of h7. After queen takes, a check from the knight. King to h7 is forced, but then the knight takes the queen with double check, and after king to h8, queen h7 is mate. And if instead g6, then we can just keep it simple with rook f7 check, winning the queen, and after queen takes, bishop takes, and rook e7, we can take more material with bishop takes pawn check. And whether black trades that bishop off or not, white will remain material up, but more importantly, the black king is just too weak to survive. Really nice win by Spassky. If you want to play the King's Gambit, Spassky just has to be a great role model for that. There are so many great attacking wins like this one. Maybe the exact lines he used can be improved upon nowadays, but for sure you will be inspired by his play. Anyway, if you also like the game, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. You would really help me out. Check out the playlist for many more great games. More games are always in the making. I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.